Work. All right.
All right.
Yes. Okay, and now I'm going to start the cloud recording here. All right, I am so ridiculously excited to have this conversation with you, Miss Dr. Claire Nelson. In all honesty, I recently learned about you from my colleague, Jada Quinlan, who is absolutely wonderful. And she absolutely gushed about what an impactful legacy that you have been leaving in the Caribbean, and also how much of an influence and a shira that you have been in her own life personally. And I absolutely understand why now that I've done some research on you. Your career is bespeckled with numerous highlights and achievements, ranging from being the first Jamaican woman to earn a PhD in engineering, serving on many boards and committees, the advocacy work that you do, and of course, your writing and leadership of the Peaceable Futures project. And while we won't have time to delve into all of the various ways that you are amazing, I definitely wanted to learn more about the projects that have been more akin to your brainchild, such as the Peaceable Futures Project. So with that, I'm going to ask you a bit more about that initiative. Can you explain its goals and how it aims to transform the region's approach to peace, security, and conflict transformation?
Well, actually, Peaceable Futures is still just an idea of mine. It has not yet been funded, unfortunately. The idea first came to me when I was working on Guyana many years ago, and I saw the beginnings of what is now happening, which is a potential for ethnic conflict. The situation with oil has been also rife with rising tensions between different political parties, which tend to be along racial lines. And so I think that to the extent that we want the Caribbean to remain a zone of peace, we have to be very intentional about that. In addition to, let's say, the ethnic conflicts, we have political conflict that happens certainly in Jamaica and other places which have entrenched, let's say, political parties which are entrenched, like safe seats, quote unquote, what we call garrisons communities. And you see many garrison communities in Jamaica, for one, are very highly violent communities. They're not safe and quiet. They're safe and violent, which begs the question as to why the safe seats for senior politicians are so violent after so many years. So what it is that's driving the gun violence, the endemic poverty. And I do think the Caribbean region, if we're going to have any kind of inclusive prosperity going forward, we have to stop just doing studies and do more engagement of people in the conversations around what for them constitutes peace, what for them constitutes a life worth living, even if you're poor. But why should you be poor and miserable? Right? It's one thing to be poor and not miserable. At least you can enjoy yourself. You can go any time of night you want. You can eat as many mangoes as you want, etc. within the confines of what you can afford. It's quite another to be poor and live in fear that a gun fight is going to break out, that your children will go to school, but gun fear war might break out at the school grounds. Yeah. Children are going to school with knives. The whole reprisal culture. These are things that are getting worse and worse and worse. And so I think if we're talking about peace and security, and it's sort of a very thin line between peace and security, by that I mean in countries like the Caribbean where we don't have any formal wars, right? We don't have wars per se. What then constitutes peace and security? It's not that we have a war happening that has centuries of history, although these days when we see gunboats from Venezuela patrolling the waters in Guyana, we get very nervous and bent out of shape. What does it mean, right? If Venezuela was to just say, we're going to take over Guyana, we wouldn't even have the army to combat that, to be quite honest, because we don't have the same army power. Likewise for Belize and Guatemala, another border issue which has been long-standing over 200 years of history of a border dispute. So for me, the idea is, first of all, can I get enough people to even be curious about the context of Peaceable Futures? And can we do some local work to reduce the level of violence in our societies? And we see violence increasing even in small islands like Antigua, St. Kitts Nevis, St. Lucia, which didn't used to have the level of gun crime that they have today. So I think Peaceful Futures to me is an idea of having a conversations about the future we want, the peaceable futures that most people want to live in, recognizing that we'll never have total nonviolence, but how can we reduce the arbitrary violence that we tend to have right now happening in the region?
Yeah, it's interesting because it feels like the stories that we tell about our homes are so similar, even though they're in different regions, right? I'm from Philadelphia, but the story of gun violence and the story of how that is entrenched also with political will and society is so salient and relevant to how I perceive literally every decision I make in the future, whether or not I'll return to Philadelphia, if I have children, will they go to school in Philadelphia? Every concern that you listed out as concerns that people have in the Caricom region are things that I think are also present and prevalent in almost every other place, especially countries that do not have a handle on gun violence. And I feel like we could definitely go down that rabbit hole, but we are going to try our hardest to keep it a little bit lighter and definitely focus on the work that you do. So with that in mind, you wrote a book entitled Smart Futures for a Flourishing World, a Paradigm Shift for Achieving Global Sustainability. And you've already touched on a lot of the challenges that are present in the CARICOM region. But I'm wondering, what are some of the ways that you've seen in your very, very long career that people have endeavored to put forth as they have addressed these challenges and looked to create sustainable solutions?
Well, let me talk about the book first. So Smart Futures for a Flourishing World is really a prescription book for how anybody who is an advocate for a better future can use my design thinking framework to make a more teleologically effective solution. And I love the word teleologically effective. I learned it first when I was doing my doctorate in a technology assessment class. And I fell in love with the word. And I've always been eager to use it in a regular sentence. And teleologically effective means that how far from the mark will you miss, right? So you're aiming at this bullet point and you're teleologically effective 100% if you hit exactly the point you're trying to get to. Most public policy is not teleologically effective, right? They have a huge gap between the design desire or the solution you want to achieve and actually what you actually achieve. And so my thing is that I think it is because we don't have futures literate or futures competency in the way we do our program design. So whether that be a policy around education or health or crime or, food stamps, we don't have a futures approach. We don't have a systems approach. We tend to look at each problem in isolation. And so because we're looking at things in isolation and we're also making assumptions about the future which are false, we're designing for obsolescence, number one, and we're designing without taking into account the potential system in which your problem is embedded. So let's look at what that means. So if we're talking about the Smart Futures approach, the first question I tell people to ask is, what is the system you're trying to change? I have been active around the issue of sustainable tourism for some time. By active, I mean an active supporter of those people who are totally engaged in it. So I'm not 100% active the way I'm in space, for example. I'm very active in space. I can speak in more detail on that, but let me do something more generic first. So sustainable tourism is critical. Why? Because sustainable tourism and community-based tourism, as we and people like me see it, is that it allows some more of the tourist dollar to remain in country. So yes, tourism has some fabulous numbers. The Caribbean is seeing how many millions of visitors per year, but we're not seeing the gap between the haves and the have-nots decreasing, because the design of those programs do not take into account the intentional desire to have more of the money remain in community. So we don't have proper design of farmer to hotelier food chains, supply chains. We don't have the financing systems to support those farmers who want to go for tourism economy, because the hoteliers want to have 90-day credit, and having asked a farmer to plant something for 1 year, when they sell it, they really want their money like now, right? And so it's unfair to ask them to work for 90 more days for something that already has taken them a year or 2 or 3 to grow. So we need to effect a systems change around that. And so the MN SMART is a metric that I just get nervous and stressed out and irritated every time I hear a tourism minister talk about, oh, we have so many more tourist arrivals. I'm like, who cares? You know, who cares? What's the point of having tourism arrivals if the tourist is booking their trip online before they get here? That money remains and resides in a bank account in the US. It's not going into a bank in the Caribbean. So it's not providing a job for somebody to, you know, even count the ledger. There's not really any real money anyway, but the numbers in the ledger, right? Then, so when you come, you already have all of those things prepaid. So the taxi driver, that is the regular taxi driver who is not in a big corporation, is not in any work. So you have, especially cruise ship tourism, the poor drivers are waiting outside, but they're being told, oh, don't go around the islands because, you know, it's not safe. So they're bussed by the cruise ship bus to a beach, which is a private beach. And so where is the tie into the local economy? Maybe one person gets a job in driving the bus and then that's it. Okay. And the person who has to fix the bus and gas the bus. Okay, so maybe 5 people get a job. But then, so you have a cruise ship with 2,000 people, but the impact on that is that is spending 2,000 on the cruise, but maybe only $30 actually retains in the country. So what's the value of that? So we want to see more coming to tourism, be part of a smart tourism future. So the A in SMART will be to look at all the agents in the tourism sector, not just the tourist and the hotelier, but the bus drivers and the farmer and the person who comes here and the people who take care of the children of the people who have to work in the hotel, you know, and all of these people that are part of the economy, but they're not benefiting that much from this huge numbers of tourists that are coming. The R in SMART is resilience. How can we design for resilience? Because invariably something doesn't work. I mean, things break all the time. How do you design for resilience? So in the case of a tourism sector, it could be that we had a hurricane or we had a flood or we had a drought. Something is going to happen to disrupt the flow of tourists from coming in, or once they come in, something happens and then they don't come back. We don't have return visitors. How do you prepare for those eventualities that occur that make it challenging for us to continue providing good service? And finally, the Teen SMART is transformational use of technology. And in this case, we definitely want to look at second and third order impacts of technology and the time between when that second and third order impact would occur. So for example, if you're using a phone or some new device to check your tourists in, and it's fantastic, but this device has some new internal innards that have never been used before, and there's no recycling or e-waste system to collect it, then what is the point? You're just bringing more waste. You're bringing more plastic waste, more e-waste, more toxic waste, which small islands tend to not have a problem to solve. We really are inundated with e-waste in small islands. What is the solution for that? So this is a framework around which you can use those questions to address any policy you're thinking about analyzing to get at a better answer than you would do if you just use your regular way of thinking about it. That's my story and I'm sticking to it, right? You may not believe me, but I'm sticking to it. And so for my work as an advocate or actionist is heavily embedded in space futures and ocean futures. And I would say right now my space is ahead of my ocean. but the ocean is equally important for the Caribbean, because if the Caribbean Sea dies, we're in serious trouble. And I'm very, very, very worried that the rate of which we're going, the Caribbean Sea could meet an untimely death. So hence my trying to be very visible, very much get on the horn, try to get people thinking about how do we start putting in place a sustainable sea? How do we start educating more people about the value of the sea to our welfare and our well-being? How do we as civil society get together to push governments to do the right thing? And this is really a movement that's waiting to be started. And I'm hoping we can get that started this year.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna ask about climate change, because obviously people who are from the Caribbean live and die by, to your point, the Caribbean Sea. And we also know that smaller island nations are typically the most impacted, even if they do not create the most waste from climate change. But I feel like you kind of talked about it all. However, if you would like to talk more about the advocacy work that you do actively do in that space, what roles you've held, and anything like that, I do want to make space for that before we move on to another question.
Well, let's talk about space for the time being, as in outer space, and put in the context of the women of color advancing peace and security.
And conflict transformation.
That's correct, right? Women of color advancing.
And peace, security, and conflict transformation.
Okay, that part. All right.
It's a mouthful. It's okay. W
It's a
caps.
mouthful, right? But double C caps, or double caps. All right. I would really like to see outer space remain a zone of peace. And the challenge with our current behavior is that we tend to do what we have always done. And when you hear people talking about the future of space, it's very much against the lines of the past. So they're thinking about how are we going to ensure that we get a return on investment on any mining that we do on Mars or on the moon. All right. Mm-hmm. For a company that is a single person owned company. This is, to me, is problematic, because the fact is, up until now, the construct of a single person having that much influence over a celestial body was unheard of. Celestial bodies like the moon, Mars, etc., are considered by many people to be sacred. So then how are we going to share this resource in a way that honors and respects all of human heritage? Because every single person that looks up at the night sky and sees the moon or sees the planets or the stars have equal right to benefit from the, let's say, the goods, quote unquote, that these celestial objects provide. So we're now inundated with conversations that would reduce the moon only to an economic resource, which is problematic. Yeah. My advocacy then is around ensuring that I'm in a room in enough places that if somebody says something that kind of strikes me as like, what did I hear right? I can jump in and say something, or I can respond with a snarky comment in the chat if I don't feel like talking and say, yeah, right. You know, so that the moon is just a resource, an economic resource now, for example. The moon is not just an economic resource to be mined. The moon is also part of the Earth ecosystem. And the sooner we also amplify and make this a common thinking, is better for all of us, because the moon is not separate from us. The Earth, the planet Earth, needs the precise tilt and wobble of the moon that currently exists to ensure that we have the precise tidal waves and systems that we have and magnetic force that we do. And so when people say things like, oh, if we were to use nuclear energy on the moon and some disaster happened, it wouldn't have any impact on Earth. Oh, really? How do you know that? Oh, because we know it wouldn't have any impact on the moon. Oh, really? How do you know that? We do not know enough. And so for me as an actionist, I am very present in the space community because I want to at least be there to strike a cautionary tale. Like, wait, slow down. Before we jump and do this, have you checked to see if we have any serious proxy research variables we can do research on to ensure that we're not making bad technological choices.
Or really the same mistakes, right? Because that, to your point, that is historical practices being put into play. Oh, we can rape and pillage in the Amazon and it's not going to have any impact on us. We can rape and pillage in the Arctic and it's not going to have any impact on us. We've said that for generations, and now we're literally, our generation right now is seeing that that idea is wrong. So how do you keep taking that same mindset and applying it to different places? We
Right.
would
I
call
just came out of
right.
a I'm citizen advisor to Engineering for One Planet, which is an initiative of the Lemerson Foundation. We just came out of a meeting trying to talk about how could we do an Engineering for One Planet prize. What would that look like? How do we get students interested and involved? What kind of prizes we can raise? How can we get some serious money to give some really great prizes? These are all questions we have. And I say that to say, even though I don't have any time, I said, yes, I'll be involved because I am that worried that I feel like, what's the point of worrying if I can't do something to at least advance my cause? So for me, my personality is such that if I'm going to worry about something, I try to find even one thing, one group I can join, so I can at least feel like I'm trying to do something to stop the thing I fear from happening. And so the future I fear is an equal driver for me as the future I want. I may not have a picture totally of what our future in space is going to be, but I know what I don't want. I don't want to go to war. I don't want to have a space law that allows private sector ownership of anything on the moon, on Mars. And those two are really two huge issues that have yet to be decided by humanity. And so one of the things I proposed when I was selected as a Ascend Diverse Dozen is a program of the American Institute for, I think, astronomics or something, aeronautical astronautics, one of those things. Every year they choose 12 people since the last 3 years that are from different ethnic backgrounds and genders, etc., who have good ideas about creating space for all and space sustainability. And so my proposal, which allowed me to be selected, that I wanted to create like a digital modeling system that would allow us to make better decisions, to support the decision making around like space debris, space traffic management, spectrum management, and all the ways in which we're going to be conflicted in the future if we continue to send things up, and
never bring them back down.
So that's what I'm heavily, it's one of the things I'm heavily engaged in is the space sustainability conversation.
Okay, so we can't separate space from future. And honestly, we've dropped that word like at least 5, 10 times. And so what role can the Future Generations Commission play in shaping long-term strategies for peace and security, whether it comes to space law, whether it's about the Caribbean region as what's happening in the Caribbean Sea and climate change a little bit closer to Earth? And how does the diasporic community, specifically Caribbean Americans, what role can they play in that space to assist and to make sure that they are elevating the topics that are important and salient to the region and area as a whole?
Well, first of all, we have the wonderful opportunity of the UN Summit of the Future, which is about to have its final meeting in September. And that process has resulted in 3 draft documents, one on Pact for the Future, which is about global multilateral movements, of which there's one continuing paragraph about space. There's nothing about the ocean, but I intuited it. So one of the things we're doing is trying to build out a Space Matters Impact Coalition of volunteers who want to basically watch what's happening globally and to be able to comment on it and form an integrated group that we can now speak to the UN about issues that we care about. So the Futures for my NGO signed up to run the one for space, and along with a colleague of mine from Fiji, she's the lead. So she's the lead on the one for oceans, and I'm supporting her in that because, again, as I said, I knew I couldn't be the lead for both, but it's too much work. And it's volunteer work. But I think it's important that small island women states definitely push for this Ocean Matters Futures Coalition to be continually monitoring, whatever we have access to right now and strengthening our data and understanding of the ocean matters or Caribbean Sea matters. So there's that piece. So that's the Committee of the Future piece. The other two elements are the Digital Compact, the Global Digital Compact, and then the Futures Generation Declaration. And this is where your question is now important. The Declaration of Futures Generation, I think, did not have the kind of a review it should have had, because most of us who are people of African descent are not plugged into what the UN is doing and where. We just are not focused, especially here in North America. I'm afraid the Caribbean, maybe we are more engaged, but we're not that focused. And so we came to the table quite late on this matter. That said, we still think it's important that we showed up and we created a working space for conversations around, Declaration of Future Generations by getting young people engaged. And we want to push out that work with Caribbean Americans here, Caribbean people on the ground, because we think the issue of a Declaration of Futures Generation is ripe for exploitation by the right young person who will say, hey, it's an opportunity for me to do some real, troublemaking in a good way.
Yeah.
Right? What do I mean by this? If we had a Declaration of Future Generations that favor the health of the sea, and we're able to have the sea declared a person in its own right, we now have the tools to go to court and file a lawsuit on behalf of the well-being of the sea. In these days, we don't have that. And so each country is fending for itself, and depending on the politics of the country, you can't fend too hard. If you fend too hard, you might get a slap on the wrist.
Yeah.
So, we have work to do.
Yeah. I feel like there was so much in there that I wish personally, if you wouldn't mind, I would love to just have a conversation at a later date where we don't have a time limit, because I feel like there's a wealth of knowledge that I have yet to fully tap into. But as we are rounding out our conversation here, and you spoke a little bit about the young person who would pick up this torch, so to speak, and carry it forward. So what role do you see visionary leadership playing in addressing these challenges and working towards sustainability? And how can Caribbean American leaders and others and other youth become more visionary in their approach to peace and conflict resolution, especially when we are kind of stuck in these entrenched systems? You mentioned the UN as a space where we can definitely go into and have changes, but as we've seen in the year of our Lord 2024, the UN doesn't necessarily have the teeth and the power behind it that is necessary to really affect the changes that are needed on a country to country, let alone a global scale. So what are your thoughts there?
I, first of all, think that Caribbean American community organizing is in deep straits. We don't have enough young people who are plugged into what we, the older people, are doing. And that is problem number 1 and 2 and 3. I say that because young people are organized differently. They don't want to necessarily be around their parents or grandparents. But then in some ways, they're doing the same thing over just in a new way. And we've been there, done that. And it didn't work, right? Because even though, yes, cultures and generational behavior changes across, the generation that you're in, baby boomer or whatever, millennial, etc. The reality is that Caribbean culture is different from, let's say, the American culture in which the kids that are born here are brought up in. And our
Yeah.
Caribbean American diaspora organizations tend to be organized with the culture of the home country. If that makes sense to you.
Yes.
So a typical Jamaican or Haitian organization is not designed to run like a traditional US NGO. There's a little bit more fluidity, a little bit more personality in the room. You know, people, you know how it is when Caribbean people argue, it's loud and boisterous. These are not the premises by which Robert Rules of Order were designed to keep us in check when we go to the Jewish home organizations. So we need to do something about that. We're trying with our Ignite Caribbean program, which is a part of National Caribbean American Heritage Month. But I don't think we have reached a critical mass of young members that we've honored over the last 6 years, coming back and working with us and talking to us and doing joint projects and taking over leadership. We really wanted to have this network of young people be groomed to take over leadership from us at ICS, because at the end of the day, Caribbean American Heritage Month will belong to them and their children's children.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting because I find that I'm odd. I enjoy sitting down and talking with my elders personally because the history that you all have lived through in the last century alone is absolutely, I'm flabbergasted that some of you are even still here, still sane, still willing to give back, still in the space because of what you had to combat. And as a young person, technically, I do feel that there is some type of disconnect. Like, I think we think history is longer than it is. And so we don't have the respect to a certain extent that we should for the folks who have just done the work. Like, you just did the work in the 90s and people treated it as if, oh no, she did the work. It was like, centuries ago. And she's just magically somehow still here and alive. And it's like, no,
That
this
is
was
so
just the
true.
90s.
That is
It's right here.
That is so true, and it's never more evident. The place I find is more evident, quite actually, is the UN Permanent Forum of People of African Descent. That's one of the most frustrating things to me when they had a UN Decade of People of African Descent and the Permanent Forum, because back in 2001, 1990 and 2001 was when we did all the prep conferences, and both of us were like pushing from behind. And I had the distinction of being one of the few bureaucrats that also was involved on my activist side. So I was like a Jekyll and Hyde. I'd be there as my official organization. I'm also in the room as my diaspora organization, which was probably a good reason why my supervisors thought I was slightly crazy. But I could not, as a Black person, be in a room talking about the future of Black people and not, be Black in that room. And not representing this in the perspective of the white organization. I represented the voice of the Black people.
Yeah.
So now, there's so many things that we learned in that process. And then when it was now eventually a program, many of us who were in that lead up had gotten tired or whatever, and just were not as active. So somehow the UN had a whole bunch of new people getting all the grants and showing up to all these meetings. And I show up to them and I'm like, because the time I went to the Brazilian meeting, I was expecting to see my people, like, Edwina from Peru and Angelica from Argentina. And I'm like, so where's everybody? Because we were the crew that made this happen. They were not there.
Yeah.
I had to think, was this deliberate? Because so much was lost by not having that group that was in the trenches working on the issue from day one, being present in that decade. So we didn't even know what to do for the first 5 years of the decade because it was all new people. They were not involved in the lead up to Durban. They did not understand all the fighting that went on and the struggle to get together across, Black Americans versus Caribbean Blacks versus Latin America. It was like a comeback to Jesus Garvey moment, really. But it took us work to get there and be respectful of each other because, Americans, for example, used to taking up room couldn't understand why they would have the same level of importance as, Caribbean islands that only had 10,000 people. Well, that's because they're a nation, even though it's 10,000 people, right? And the UN, so they have a vote. So you,
Yeah.
with your US government law that says slavery can't be a crime against humanity, it's not going to be very helpful in this moment. You want to get the Caribbean NGOs in the room. You want to groom them because they can harass their members to vote, and we might get somewhere with this slavery being a crime against humanity. But it was a very painful process to get to that. And so this is one example where I look at that movement and say, who are these people? I don't know who they are. Nobody's ever reached out to me to say, hey, you were the person for the issue of the Inter-American Development Bank. You work to promote the Black agenda. Nobody's ever reached out to me to ask me, what did I learn? How it worked? What went wrong? What went
File got
right?
lost.
So for me, it's like a loss of mentor capital that could be invested in moving towards a more teleologically effective decision around what to do with the Black agenda, quote unquote.
Yeah. My immediate thought is the files got lost. There are so many annals that from the UN, from meeting spaces such as this, where we didn't necessarily have technology that streams directly to YouTube and records it on your computer, where people said, oh, I lost the floppy disk, or oh, the contact information just got washed away. And that has been such an inhibitor, to your point, for mentorship potential, but also for programmatic momentum, because we're always starting from ground zero.
Exactly.
Because we always lose the information. And that is quite irritating. And with that, I just want to leave it for any final thoughts that you have that you would like to share with our viewers, and then we shall close out.
Well, I think that, first of all, just to be clear, Caribbean American Heritage Month, I'm bringing this up because it's an issue that people are talking about. There is an issue about Caribbean versus being African American versus being Black. So, for example, I prefer the term Black History Month because when you say Black History Month, it includes people like me. When you say African American History Month, then we begin to figure, does it include people like me, or because it's not so clear where my history lies. Now, mind you, having been here for the last 40 years, clearly I've spent more of my life here than at home in Jamaica. I would say some of what I've done has contributed to Black history, right? In the sense that being the first only Black woman in my class at Buffalo, I don't know if I was the first Black woman in my engineering class. I probably was, because I didn't see any before me. But, be that as me, nobody ever said that. But for my entire 3 years at college, there was nobody in engineering in my department that looked like me. There's one person behind me, but there's none ahead of me. So now that's a micro history. But Caribbean American Heritage Month, to be clear, is not about separating ourselves from Black people. First of all, Caribbean people are all races, right? We have Chinese Caribbean, Indo-Caribbean, African Caribbean, and really Caribbean American Heritage Month was conceived as a way of organizing the Caribbean voice such that we could be more civically engaged. A lot of people have never been civically engaged in this country. And let's look at gun violence right here in this country. It's pretty high. We're getting very nervous these days about going into crowded places. Black bodies. As a Black body, I feel very nervous when I go certain places. I don't go certain places if I don't have to. I'm not comfortable in the way I used to be. And it's sad that I have to voice that publicly. I don't often say it, but I think since this platform is about peace and security, I should be honest about how I feel about my peace and security. And so it's frustrating when you have Caribbean people who pretend as if to say their children aren't born here, their grandchildren aren't born here. They still are behaving as if to say they just came to America 5 years ago and are still planning to go back home and retire. They're not. And so you have got to recognize that you have a responsibility and a privilege to be part of this democracy. And so Caribbean American Heritage Month is about organizing for agency, getting our visibility as a group. We now are visible, where we're able to help to cajole the census into changing the rules. So now you can write in your country of origin. So you do Black, Jamaica, Nigeria, Haiti, France, England, Indian, ethnically Asian, Guyana, Suriname, Trinidad, Jamaica, right?
Yeah.
Okay, they're gonna be fewer ones of them there, obviously. But I remember telling the census, you can't assume that Asian Pacific heritage, because you tie it together as one, that you won't find a Jamaican in there or a Trinidad in there, because the Trinidad is not going to type in Black. If I'm an Indo Trinidadian with a name like, Ramsa, Rupa, or whatever, I'm not going to type in Black because my ethnicity is Asian Indian.
Yeah.
But I still want to count as Trinidad, right? So
Yeah.
we had to dissuade them from attaching any assumption of country of origin with the racial group of a group. So America is very specific about collecting racial statistics because of our history. And I think we should continue to do this, even though, DI is being killed or DI is dead, right? The fact is, even though DI is dead, the issue of equity and justice for all cannot be dead until we have achieved it, and we haven't. So we can call it something else, right? What's in the name? I think we could call it the apples and orange movement and still move in that direction. So I want to say that this Capital American Heritage Month, I want to send a strong message that nobody is to misconstrue my leadership of Capital American Heritage Month as an attempt to dissect myself from the Black community. I'm first and foremost a Garveyite. And if you know anything about Marcus Garvey, he talked about the Pan-African idea, right? And as a Garveyite, I do work for the Caribbean, I do work for Africa, and I'm more and more beginning to do work for African America by the work I'm doing here, working with a university like Morgan State to figure out how can we create the the pipeline of STEM talent into the university. I think we need to find more ways of working together. I need to find more ways of also turning the gaze of WCAPs inward to the American context, inner city context, because many of us who are involved in WCAPs commented from an international development context, but still we have the same problems here at home, in inner city Baltimore, for example. So how can we take these lessons, right? And how can we borrow from what we know as international experts and say, hey, maybe we can do a development assistance intervention in inner city Baltimore that looks like what we did in Kingston and looks like what we did in Haiti, except we're going to turn our lens inwards, turn our gaze on ourselves to help create a better life for our people here, as well as what we're doing internationally. And stop pretending that everything in America is hunky-dory. Because with the recent attacks, violent attacks on people of African descent, just simply because we happen to be walking around with this color skin, is very frightening.
Yeah.
That's not a good place to end. I don't want to end there.
No, I got you. Don't worry. You tapped on two very, very important topics to WCAPs, Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation. One is the idea that women of color are not subject to just being from one place or one race. We talked about my name earlier, which is obviously very French, especially my last name, Mond, or German, depending on what language you're coming from. And that denotes a history. And for a lot of folks, that is the case. To your point about the Indian folks who are still Trinidadian and the differences and identities that exist there, WCAPS is hoping to create a platform where all of these people can come together, build network together, build community together, and have these conversations. While at the same time, not neglecting the fact that we cannot continue to look outward and pretend that we don't have to deal with these same struggles internally to the US, to even WCAPS as a communal organization of women who are coming from Nigeria, Brazil, the US, from Canada, from all these different places, where we have different connectivity issues and challenges that we face when we want to have conversations, because we all have different perspectives. And that is a part of the beauty of working in peace and conflict transformation, is that we can have these conversations. We can sit down at these tables and we can walk away still respecting each other and still valuing the personhood of the person who we just had a conversation with. So I would like to thank you again, Dr. Claire Nelson, for taking the time this evening, for sitting down for this conversation with me. I have learned so much from you in this brief talk, and I'm very much looking forward to getting a copy of your book and figuring out.
Guys, and
how I
to end on
can
an optimistic note, but lest anybody think I'm a pessimist, I am.
I think you're a realist.
I try very hard to be an optimist. And what my book does is it has a series of hope. I did a story. I have a one-woman show called Red Sky Falling, right? And it starts, red sky falling, Mother Earth is calling, the future is warning, turn around, turn around. Red sky falling, Mother Earth is calling, the future is warning, turn around, turn around. And it says, this is how the world ends. And Nancy wakes up, shaken but not stirred. That was a dream, or was it the world ending? But how could it be? And then the story goes on where Anansi goes off to different corners of the world, and he meets with elder bear, elder dragon, elder tiger, elder whale. And finally, and each of them says, I don't know how, I don't know when, but this is how the world could end. And they call out the ways in which they could earn. Is it going to be nuclear waste? Is it going to be, wars without end? Is it going to be a virus gone mad? All the ways in which we could self-destruct. Yeah. But in the end, Elder Nancy goes to Elder Elephant, and she says, and I deliberately made Elder Elephant the only female, right? And Elder Elephant, of course, represents the continent of Africa. And Elder Elephant, she says, I don't know how, and I certainly don't know when, because I don't know the beginning. So how much I know the end? Don't we have a prayer? World without end, amen, amen. The world is a story we're telling ourselves, my friend. So stories without a beginning and stories without an end. All we are is just a hyphen. And it ends there. And I say that to say, my book, Smart Futures for Flourishing, also uses Anansi as a device for collecting the stories in ways in which we're coming together to save ourselves. Double Caps is one such story. It's a story of hope. Somebody woke up and said, I think if more Black women were engaged in this conversation, we might have more wisdom at the table to save ourselves from self-extinction or self-extermination, depending on how you look at our behavior, right? I like to say extermination sometimes because I just think we're like cockroaches. But the reality is that we are telling ourselves a story, and Double Caps is a story of hope, because we're trying to work together to solve problems before they become catastrophic and become such that they could also lead to another way in which we could self-destruct as a species. So I am not pessimistic about the future. I'm optimistic that coming together as Caribbean American Heritage Month, that's another story. Double Caps is another story. All the ways in which we self-organize to do what we can do to make a difference, to create that edge tip to the better world that we want. I think all of what we're doing is all occasion for us to feel hopeful. And so that is really the story I want to leave behind.
And that is a beautiful story to leave behind. That is going to be on repeat in my head. So thank you for that. But
One day I'll do the show for you guys. Maybe you can have a fundraiser for the organization and bring me in to do the show. And we have an audience participation discussion and see what else arises from the collective when we try to have a conversation about all the ways as we as a species can turn incredibly our lizard brain against each other. And then use the other side of the story is finding ways in which we tell stories of how we arrive at peaceable futures, right? Because that's a collective story that we have to tell. How does WCAPS help us to create peaceable futures, the futures we want?
And that is a beautiful note to end on. So once again, thank you, Dr. Claire Nelson, for your time. Thank you those who came to watch with us. We are extremely blessed to have this platform, and we are so thankful for all the wisdom and all the knowledge that